The Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. My name is Joni Siegel, and I'm the host for this podcast. My husband, Steve Siegel, is the producer of the podcast. And while you don't get to see him on camera or hear him in our audio versions, he does most of the work behind the scenes on the podcast. Today's episode is episode number 279, although if you try and keep track of the numbers, they might go a little wonky because we did an interview recently. We're probably going to put it up out of order because I think it's that important. But number-wise, today is 279, and we do have an interview today. Just a reminder to please subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you have an interest in advertising, we have over 500,000 downloads now. So if advertising to our niche, which is people who have an interest in the area of addiction, if that is something you're interested in, well, reach out to us and talk to us about it. Also check out our YouTube channel, because since January 2020, we have been videoing our interviews, and subscribe to that channel and give us a thumbs up. When you give us a good rating, it helps people find us. Like Google will put us up when people search for addictions on podcasts, and a podcast on addiction, and that's what we want, because we want people to find us and to get some of the messages of hope and help that we put out. Today's interview is an interview with a gentleman named John Brownlee. If you watched the Dopesick miniseries docudrama on Hulu, then you will know that John Brownlee plays the boss of Rick Mountcastle, who is played by Peter Sarsgaard, and John Brownlee in the series is played by Jake McDorman. If you are a Jake McDorman fan, then you already know that. John Brownlee is a former federal prosecutor whose prosecution and conviction of Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of the widely abused opioid OxyContin, was portrayed in the hit Hulu series Dopesick, starring Michael Keaton, Rosario Dawson, and Jake McDorman. He was appointed U.S. State's Attorney for the Western District of Virginia in 2001 by President George W. Bush, and served in that position with great distinction for nearly 7 years. After his over a decade of service at the U.S. Department of Justice, he became a criminal defense attorney and successfully defended numerous individuals and corporations, including former Governor Bob McDonnell. Prior to law school, he served on active duty in the U.S. Army in the infantry and in the Judge Advocate General Corps, U.S. Army Reserves, that's JAG. And he is a graduate of the Army's Airborne and Ranger programs. I am interested in talking to Mr. Brownlee because I want to get more skinny on what went down in the whole Purdue Pharma court case. So without further ado, let's talk to John Brownlee. John Brownlee, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Absolutely. John, just by way of background, tell us a little bit about where you grew up, how you got into law, like what made you want to be a lawyer, and tell us about you.
So I was an Army brat. My father was from West Texas, a town called Odessa, Texas. My mother was from a small town in Wyoming called Casper, and they went to University of Wyoming where they met. And then after college, my father went into the military, was in the 101st Airborne in 1962, kind of during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then I was born in 1965. My dad was actually in Ranger School when I was born. And then that kind of took us on a lot of different posts throughout the country and overseas. And then as I entered high school, we moved to Northern Virginia. My father was stationed at the Pentagon. And so I went to high school here in right outside of Washington, D.C. And then I got an ROTC scholarship to go to college. Went to a small private school in Virginia called Washington and Lee. And then when I was finished with school, I went into the military and did my 4-year commitment. And so I was an infantry officer like my father, not nearly as good, but I did that and learned a lot. It was really kind of important development. I went to Ranger School and Airborne School and those things. And then when my commitment was up, I got out and went to law school at William and Mary on the eastern part of Virginia.
What made you want to be a
Um,
lawyer?
I guess I'd read some books, kind of watched it, movies and things. It always interested me, intrigued me, kind of from a very young age. We didn't have any lawyers in the family, but it was always something that I felt I wanted to do. I knew that I would go into the military. That was kind of an important family tradition, I guess, that I would do that. And then when my commitment was done, that I could go on to other schooling and did. And I'm really glad I did. I remember when I was in law school, so many of my classmates' parents had been lawyers, and I had none of that, so I was a little bit behind, but tried to catch up. But yeah, that's what really interested me, just pursuing the law and kind of what I had read or watched.
Okay. I was going to say, were you reading Grisham? Is that what got you interested?
I did read some Grisham. I think he kind of came out when I was in law school, but
Oh,
To Kill
okay.
a Mockingbird was always a great one that I
Yeah.
read, or maybe my parents read it to me pretty young.
That's a great inspiration. I like
Yeah, it was
that.
a great book. Yeah,
Yeah.
great book.
Did you have any interest? Like, did you know what kind of law you wanted to do? Did you want to be a defense attorney, a prosecuting attorney? Did you have any idea about that or just
Yeah, I mean,
whatever?
I think as I got into law school, being a prosecutor really interested me. I remember after my second, I guess it was after my first year, I interned in a Commonwealth Attorney's office in a little county in Virginia called Isle of Wight County. And the Commonwealth Attorney's name was Parker Counsel. What a great name for a lawyer.
Yep.
And he really, I got to kind of tag along with him for a summer, and I watched him and learned a lot and kind of gained more interest in that. And then when I graduated, before I graduated, I got a clerkship with a federal judge in Roanoke, a guy named Sam Wilson. And I worked for him for 2 years, and he was fantastic. And so really through that process, really decided that's what I wanted to do. I had good professors in evidence and criminal law when I was in law school that kept the interest going, but that was kind of it.
Interesting. Interesting. So, okay. So then you were in the, sorry, I have to look at my notes. I'm really bad. How did you become a federal prosecutor?
And so when my clerkship was over with Judge Wilson, I went to a small firm in Roanoke, Virginia. It was a great firm, really great people, but I knew I wanted to get into the courtroom. And so I applied for U.S. attorneys' offices throughout the country and got an offer from Eric Holder, who was the United States attorney in D.C. at the time. And so, you really start at the bottom there. I mean, I did appeals first and then did misdemeanors and then felonies, and you kind of work your way up. But I really learned how to build a case. I learned how to work in the grand jury. I learned how to talk to juries, talk to judges. I was there about 4 years. It was just a great learning experience, probably the best I've ever had,
Wow.
and met some wonderful people and wonderful judges. So it was a great opportunity.
It sounds like you get a good apprenticeship in that particular office. Do you
You
know what I
really
mean?
do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a unique office in the sense because DC is not a state, the federal prosecutors handle everything. So
Uh,
my first trial was a fight outside of a bar, right? I mean, it was that kind of stuff. And you do a lot of domestic violence cases. He said, she said, which are tough cases, right? A lot
yeah.
of times your witnesses don't want to be there.
Yeah.
And then you do a lot of narcotics cases and you learn that process. And so it is, you walk into court, you have a lot of trials. So I had done a lot of jury trials very quickly. And through trial and error, as they say, you learn. And I hope I did. And really watching other people who
Right.
were a lot better than I was, but they were really great.
Oh,
So I did that for 4 years. And so when I came out of that process after 4 years, I had done a lot of jury trials. I had been on my feet a lot as a trial lawyer, and I had been able to kind of watch and learn from some of the best.
wow. That's awesome. I can imagine that probably helped you with the next chapter that I want to talk about.
I think so.
How did you first become aware of possible fraudulent marketing. I'm going to make that sound really politically correct. I could say it
Sure.
other ways from my viewpoint, but how did you
Right.
become aware of Purdue and what they were doing?
So when my time as an assistant U.S. attorney, when President Bush was elected in 2000, um, I really wanted to be the United States attorney. As you know, in our system, there are 94 judicial districts throughout the United States, and each one has a U.S. attorney that's appointed by the president, and then a lot of assistant U.S. attorneys, which I had been in D.C., who work for that U.S. attorney. And so I really wanted to be U.S. attorney. I was pretty young at the time. I think I was 35, 36, I guess, when I was appointed, which was very young and still by other standards pretty much is.
Do you apply? So you apply and say, I
You
want to
do.
be, no?
When the president was elected, I notified my senators, Senator
Okay.
Warner, John Warner of Virginia, and George
Okay.
Allen at the time of Virginia, that I wanted to do it. And I went through the process. I interviewed multiple times, interviewed at the Justice Department, and was very blessed to have been picked. I think the fact that I had clerked in the district, that I had been a federal prosecutor, that I had been in the military, I think those things, I was a little bit older. Even though I was only out of law school about 4 years, I was a little bit older than some others. I guess I was out of law school about 6 years. And so I got appointed and was sworn in on August 30th of '01.
Okay.
About 10 days later, 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
So it really changed how the Justice Department was, its mission. But before I was appointed, I did a lot of studying and reading the district and what was going on. And if you go back and look at some of those articles, there was a stream of articles about OxyContin and about the crime that was around that. I think every pharmacy in Russell County, Virginia had been robbed, right? And the days of leaving your doors unlocked were gone. And it was really hitting at that time. It had been introduced in the 90s, and by that time it was really getting to be bad. And when I talked to lawyers, they were prosecuting doctors. And so it was kind of on the radar, not big time. And then of course 9/11 happened. So we all kind of started focusing on international terrorism and all those things. We focused a lot on just violent crime. It was an area of focus for the administration. So we did a lot of felons with firearm cases. We did a lot of violent crime cases, kidnappings and all that stuff. But the OxyContin was just there, and there was a lot of violence around it. And so when I met with Rick and Randy, and one of the things Dopesick does that pretty accurately. I would, travel the district. I drove a lot. It's 143 miles from my house in Roanoke to Abingdon's office. I knew it well. And I remember meeting with Rick and Randy, and they kind of told me about it. It was very early. But I was like, yeah, let's see what's there. I mean, we prosecuted the doctors and the street guys and the pharmacies and the pharmacists, but there seems to me this problem is more pervasive than that. And so we authorized the subpoenas in December of '02 that really began the investigation.
Right. And I think, I hope I'm not talking out of school, but I think I remember
Yeah.
Rick saying that because of 9/11, they were a little bit kind of on their own because most of the resources kind of had to go in a different direction.
I think that's right. A lot of federal agents at that time were interviewing witnesses related to international terrorism. If you look at the Western District of Virginia, we have Virginia Tech, big university. We have UVA. We have Radford, a lot of other public and private schools. And so the FBI and ATF and a lot of those folks were out doing interviews of potential related to those issues. But again, this district always had a history of that the prosecutors themselves were very active.
Right.
A lot of offices, the prosecutors stay inside and the agents go build the cases and bring it to them. It's not how I was taught. And I think that Rick and Randy and many others, Tom Bondurant, who was a criminal chief, certainly was the leader of this, that you got to get out of that office and you got to go talk to people. And that's how you find out what's really going on. And so once we authorized those subpoenas, they started that. I thought the movie did a good job of kind of showing how these prosecutors really work out in the field.
Right. And at what point when they were bringing you information and reporting to you what they found, at what point could you see, wow, this is going to be big, or this is possibly bigger than maybe than you had thought even?
Yeah. So, it's incremental. It's little pieces of information, and these are, these were very experienced prosecutors, but none of us had kind of done anything like this before. And so, I think when you start getting information about FDA officials doing certain things, when you start to talk to people on the ground about how people are reacting to the OxyContin, and you start to see doctors' offices with lines out of them, you hear about the pill mills, you start to see some of the marketing materials come in, it just starts to build. And I don't think any of us anticipated it became quite the case that it was, at least certainly not for me. But I think over time, you start to realize that this was just one massive lie about a product. And because of that lie, it got really out into the bloodstream of the community, and it caused a ton of harm, direct harm and indirect harm. So, you could see it build over time.
I was going to say, you were really dealing with the big guns. When you talk about dealing with a company like Purdue Pharma, you're talking about like a multi-billion-dollar company. And
Right.
then when you factor in whatever the FDA's part was in that, I mean, you're starting to get into the big guns there, John.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, at that time, I never really saw it that way. I think that, the real power there is the power of a federal grand jury. Right? A federal grand jury can demand records, demand videos, demand testimony. And I don't care where it's based. It is a powerful tool if you have the judges to back you up and you follow the rules. And these prosecutors were doing that. You can really build a case if you're willing to put in the legwork. Rick and Randy, I thought that the movies or the episodes described that and showed that really well, of just their work ethic.
Yep.
Their own integrity, their willingness to kind of, follow the rules and do it right. It's hard. There are no real shortcuts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they did that, and that's what was expected of them, and were able to build a successful case.
Right. Were you in on the chicken meeting?
I was, yes.
Tell us just about that, because for anybody that
Yeah.
didn't listen to our interview with Rick and hasn't seen Dopesick, it's a pretty funny story.
The way the Justice Department works is that the Deputy Attorney General, who is kind of like the COO of the Justice Department, right?
Okay.
The Attorney General is the CEO, and the DAG, as we call him or her, is the COO. And U.S. attorneys really work for the DAG. I mean, we're appointed by the president, but at the end of the day, we work for the DAG. And I knew Jim Comey. He had been a United States attorney in New York, very successful, very dynamic. And so when we got word that he was having problems with what we were doing, I had friends at his office who was sending me emails telling me the boss is upset because he knew all the lawyers for Purdue, and they were feeding him information and basically describing us as a bunch of crazy country bumpkins down there. And so I wanted to explain to him that we were following the rules, that we were doing this right. And that, we had read all the manuals and all the policies, and we weren't violating. So that was really my intent in going up there to talk to him. You're never quite sure. You can walk into a meeting like that and be a former U.S. attorney pretty quickly if things go wrong.
Yeah.
And so when he came out and asked us why we were prosecuting the chicken guy, it kind of caught us all off guard a little bit. I had grown up in the area, so I knew about Frank Purdue, and he had these really funny commercials. And it was clear that he had been improperly briefed on that. And so once we explained to him that this was a pharma company, it wasn't the chicken guy.
I wouldn't like to be the person that briefed him that way. I'm just saying, we don't need to talk about who it was, but I'm glad that I wasn't that person. I would be a little embarrassed by that.
That's right. And so we explained to him what the case was about. He had some good questions. He's a very bright guy. And so once we explained to him this was a pharmaceutical company, OxyContin, blah, 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 he was like, go back to your district and do your case. Get out of my hair, And so I looked at Rick and said, let's run. Let's get out of here before he changes his mind.
Yeah.
And,
you are listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. For more information on the podcast or to reach out if you have a story you would like to share with us, go to our Facebook page by the same name, or you can email us at theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com, or go to our website, theaddictionpodcast.com, or call us at 727-314-7080. And please remember to subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a 5-star review. Sometimes the hardest thing about getting someone into recovery is getting them to agree to treatment. Bobby Newman, a certified drug counselor with 30 years experience and an over 85% success rate as an interventionist, has created a series of 12 videos that you can use right now to learn every step to get your loved one to agree to treatment. Call 1-833-918-0008 today and say the word podcast to get a 10% discount. Or go to newmaninterventions.com and type in the word podcast for a 10% discount. This service comes with a free 1-hour consultation with Bobby.
So we chuckled about it, but it was important because we were getting some initial pressure. He was getting some initial pressure from Purdue at that time.
And this is Purdue Pharma, not Purdue Chicken.
Right, this is Purdue Pharma.
Yeah.
And so from their lawyers. And so when we walked out of that meeting and headed back to Roanoke, I mean, I knew at that moment they had crossed the line, and we were now emboldened, right? Because now I had a green light from the boss to go do the case. And I felt really good about it at that point, even though the chicken thing happened.
Right.
At that point, the DAG puts a name with a face and a case. And so anybody else who brings it up, he's going to say, well, I just met with John, and no, I gave these guys know what they're doing. They're fine.
Right.
And so I think it was the miscalculation that they just went to the Justice Department too soon with complaints that didn't match kind of who we were. And it gave us a little tailwind there to go back and really increase the pace of the case.
I just want to say, John, I want to commend you and acknowledge you for doing it as standardly as you did, and really making sure that you dotted all the I's and you crossed all the T's, because in a case like that, had you not, and I'm a little bit of a hothead, so I would kind of tend to be like a little hot-headed on something like this and want to go start picketing Purdue. But the fact that you and Rick and Randy, Rick and Randy under your direction, really were very, very proper and legal and exacting in everything that you did, I think that's why you guys were successful in, the outcome that you got.
Yeah, I mean, I think these cases, most federal cases, if you back up, most federal prosecutors, 99.9% are extremely professional, extremely well-read, extremely bright, and they work very hard, and they try to get it right. And they don't always get it right. And now, as I've been a defense lawyer now for 13 years, I have seen where they haven't gotten it right. But by and large, they do, and they do because they work at it. And the Justice Department is a big organization. It's got a lot of rules and regulations, and taking the time to understand them, to make sure you do it right, always pays dividends at the end. Sometimes the pace of the cases can get frustrating because they do take a long time. This one did.
Yep.
But we just had a lot of good folks. And remember, when you take guys like Rick and Randy, who do a lot of cases, and kind of put them to the side and say, okay, you focus on this one thing, there's a whole bunch of other people now that have to pick up that slack.
Yep.
So guys like Tom Bondurant that I mentioned, he was a criminal chief. He was probably pound for pound the best trial lawyer I've ever seen. And he did a ton of cases. Bill Gould, who I've worked with him for 20 years. He was a great lawyer and prosecutor who picked up a lot of the pace as well. Other people, Sharon Burnham, I can name them all.
Yeah.
But so it was a real office team the Dopesick tends to focus on those who were doing it, and that's fair. But the office itself really stepped up and did it, and the agents as well.
And I appreciate that. Now, when you first describe when you guys first met with the Purdue lawyers and what that was about, and because they made sort of an offer to settle, didn't they?
They did, and that is typical. It's not unusual to come in with a pretty low offer. Our view, I think that pretty early in the case, we had a sense of what it could be. And I think that we kind of held on to that. Now, you never want to do that if the evidence changes, or,
right,
or take a case to trial that you could lose because you don't really study the law of the facts. But
right.
we understood that. So when they came in, I think their first offer was, I don't know, pretty low, a couple of $1 million or something. And we politely told them no.
And was it their origination to come see you guys, or did you ask for them to come in?
Yeah, I think the initial contact for me came through Mr. Giuliani. He was retained to represent them, and so I remember, this was before cell phones were all that prevalent. I think I had one, but and I got a call from my secretary that Rudy Giuliani had called. I kind of thought it was a joke, quite frankly, but it turned out to be accurate. And so we met with him in our Charlottesville office, and then met with him a couple other times. And his job as a defense lawyer was to try to get us to go away or to settle the case low. And I always viewed my job, because he was he was Rudy Giuliani, right?
He was a celebrity lawyer.
It was more than that. He was United States Attorney in Manhattan that had brought down the mob.
Yep.
He had been a very successful mayor of New York, 9/11.
Yep.
I think he was running perhaps, or thinking of running for president at the time. And I always felt like my job was to educate him on what this case was really about. That if I could convince him that this was as serious as I knew it would be, then I could convince him to go talk to the company to come to terms with it.
Do you think you did convince him?
I think at some point he kind of just stopped coming to the meetings. And I think that probably was why. We had a couple of meetings where, we just said, well, let me just show you the evidence. Let me show you what I got. And I think that probably convinced him that this was more serious than perhaps he thought. He never told me that. But, we had videotapes of the Purdue reps being trained. And in the tapes, they are training them to lie about the drug. I mean, that is just as good as evidence from a prosecutor. That's as good as it gets.
That's
right?
pretty damning evidence right there.
It's pretty, and from a corporate perspective, and then we had those lies in every state in the union practically. That was pretty good evidence, and I think that that was my objective as the United States Attorney, is to convince the company that this was, they had to accept this, because this was real. As we always say, there's a bad outcome and a real bad outcome, and they could pick, but it was not going to be easy. It was never going to be a $10 million fine. That was just never going to happen. And it takes several meetings, multiple meetings, for people to really hear that.
Did you get to meet? Did you meet with Richard Sackler? I think Dopesick showed you guys having a meeting with him. I'm just curious if that really happened.
Yeah, I never met with him.
Okay.
And so, our case really focused on the company and the management. It didn't, by that time, Sackler had been out of it. I mean, we knew he was there. We knew they were an owner. Our evidence at the time didn't really penetrate to that level. And, that's why the main evidence against the three principals who pled or who were convicted, they went to Congress and testified about kind of when they first learned about the problems that were coming from the product, OxyContin. And we had evidence that those were false statements.
But they lied. They knew about it way earlier.
Yeah. So, and then they took that videotape and they sent it around to their to all their company employees, saying, "Look how we're out here fighting the fight." But in sending that out, they were perpetrating the fraud. Right? It was false, And so I always felt like that was, if we had to go to trial, that was good evidence that we could have used against them individually. I think that's probably why they accepted the criminal charge and pled to it. Yeah, I never met one of the Sacklers.
Just curious.
Yeah.
So the criminal charge, was there a point at which maybe it wasn't going to be a criminal charge? Like,
yeah, it was. It was, I think that, looking back, you always ask yourself, what could you have done better? Coming out of the military and growing up the son of a military officer, the Army is really good about doing something and then coming back and evaluating how could you have done it better. I think we did a pretty good job of explaining to the company our case. Sometimes I'm not sure that we did as an effective job of explaining our case to the Justice Department, the senior leaders, because they were resistant to it. At the time, I just think that I was, young and felt like I had a righteous case and didn't want somebody at DOJ to kind of tell me what to do. I think if I were there now, I'd probably pull back, take more time and explain it to them. But there were senior leaders at DOJ that were telling us that they weren't going to authorize us to charge the individuals with felonies. Now, I think the movie's accurate in a sense. I made it very clear I didn't need their permission. But I also knew that, Department of Justice has its way of taking guys like me and making them former U.S. attorneys. And so, and we knew we needed to land this thing successfully. We needed to convict the company. To me, the most important thing that came out of the guilty plea is that we were able to tell the world through an admission of guilt to a felony that what they were saying about the product was a lie. Right? So many people were being damaged. So many doctors were out there writing these scripts, and we needed to be able to come out and say, wait a minute, hey, this is a lie. It doesn't do the things that they've been telling you, and they're now admitting that, and they're paying fines, and people are, admitting to convictions and all these things. And so I always felt like that was the key thing we needed to do to try to stop it.
And I think that's huge. I think that's huge because I think, they have to be held accountable. And that's basically what you proved, is that they have to be held accountable and they cannot lie to the public.
Right.
And get away with it. That's
right. And I think that, in convicting the top three folks, ultimately they were banned from the industry for, I forgot how many years, 12 years, effectively the rest of their careers. I thought that was an important message for senior leadership at a company that does that kind of conduct.
Yep.
And so, but there are folks who think we should have done more, and I get that. But again, for me, it was that messaging with the hope that once doctors realized they had been lied to for so long about it, that they would really change their behavior.
I think what you guys did is amazing. And I think that when people look at it and say, oh, well, you should have done more, we are a culture that watches, all the movies about the Grisham books and, and why couldn't there be some sort of, I don't know, magic bullet that you guys could have had. But I think that I think that when people look at that, they are undervaluing what you did get done. And that was what I was saying to you before, is like, you did it right. You and Rick and Randy, you did everything. You did it by the book. And had you not done it by the book, you would have you would not have gotten the prosecution that you did get. And I don't think that's something to sneeze at. I mean, there are some people who are never going to be happy. Let's just face it. But sure. I think what you guys did it's amazing. And I think you also set a precedent for other similar cases. And I think that companies in the same position as Purdue, who are marketing pharmaceuticals, I think they're going to think twice before they start lying so as to build their profits. And I think that's huge.
I think so. And so, I do believe that it did affect that change. I think that one of the things that was part of the agreement was what they call a CIA, or a corporate integrity agreement. And for the most egregious cases, we get these. And basically it's like a monitorship for the company for like 5 years. And we kind of hold these for the worst of the worst. And for these, I always felt like the CIA was critical, and that was going to be the check on them to make certain that they, in fact, complied, that they were truthful about the product, that they in fact did it by the book. The reality is that they just ignored it. The oversight wasn't very good. The company went out and hired McKinsey to consult with them on how to circumvent the CIA and to continue, in their own words, turbocharge OxyContin. And you saw the continued harm and what kind of where we are today. And so I do think that the violation of the CIA, that's why I think they ultimately were convicted and will be put out of business. But they caused a lot of harm. The company should have complied, and it didn't. And that was a big failure on the oversight of that guilty plea, because that's where the real harm continued, in my view.
Yep. Well, I think while you said, you always look back and want to figure out how you can do better. And I appreciate that, because that's what professional people do. I just think you need to make sure that and I know you do, but you just need to make sure that you take a huge win on what you did get done, what you and your office got done, in addition to all of those who didn't work directly on this case, but had to carry the load of Rick and Randy so that Rick and Randy could spend the time on this case. And that's good management from your end. So I really applaud you. I appreciate so much you being willing to talk to us today. I know you're a busy dude. Now you're a defense attorney, you said?
That's
you're on
right.
the other side? Okay,
I'm on
you're
the
on
other
the
side.
other side of the courtroom. Okay. But thank you so much. I appreciate everything you did. I think that what you guys did was only this beginning of this type of activity, and there will be more.
Right. Well, you're very kind to invite me, and what you're doing, and Steve as well, in this space is so critical. You got a lot of families out there hurting, their children and their moms and dads. It affects so many people. And I'm not so sure we as a country have really come to grips with that yet. You see, 100,000 Americans dying every year from opioid addiction or drug addiction, overdose. This fentanyl stuff is just deadly. And it cuts across politics. I think the politicians want to help. I know they do, at least the ones I've seen, but it's so hard. I thought that Dopesick at the end did a good job in kind of showing, where we go from here. I think buprenorphine plays an important role, and I think Beth's next book is about that and how we get out of this problem. But there's a lot of families that are hurting, and I think your podcast and your efforts and Steve's and others and Beth's, quite frankly, are critical because it affects so many people. One of my law partners, his son passed away from an opioid overdose, and it was just tragic. He's such a fine young guy, but everyone could be vulnerable to this, and so I just applaud your continuing efforts and appreciate what you've done and allowing me to come on here and talk about this case. Now that's 20, I guess not quite 20 years old, but it's getting a little age on it. But the sad thing is that as a country, we're still fighting this out.
Yep.
And we've got a lot of work to do on it, but folks like you all are out there still fighting it. And, for the patients who are listening, who are fighting it, our blessings are with you to give you that strength, seek help, and so that you can defeat this and go live your life. And that's the goal. So anyway, I really appreciate what you've done.
Thank you, John. We still are talking about the Hulu series Dopesick, and we still are talking about Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers, because the people who lost loved ones to OxyContin overdoses and OxyContin addiction, they are still looking for justice. And we don't feel that they've gotten it. So we are going to continue and do some of these interviews. So that was John Brownlee, and he was, he was the boss of Rick Mountcastle and Randy, and they were the ones who were doing a lot of the on-the-ground work to prosecute, create the data so that they could prosecute, not create the data, research the information, collect all of the information, really do all the legwork in order for the Justice Department to prosecute Purdue Pharma. There, I think I said that right. Anyway, thank you so much for listening today. We've got another interview that we'll have next week. Please, 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 I want to echo what John said is, we pray for you. We want you to get clean and sober. We want your loved ones to get clean and sober. And please reach out if you need help.
You have been listening to the Addiction Podcast, Point of No Return. For more information, reach out to us on Facebook or go to www.theaddictionpodcast.com. Our email is theaddictionpodcast@yahoo.com.